Hi BookTube and welcome to a new video. It's Tuesday. I was tagged by Brian at Bookish on the Pain Over Joy tag, and it was originated by Jessica at Lady Lovestead Reads, and I shall leave links to both of those videos. So having sort of briefly perused the tags, I'm going to talk about both, or my responses will be both as a writer and a reader. So I'm trying to break open the concepts behind the prompts. So prompt 1, do you mostly read books illustrating pain or books illustrating joy, and why? Well, I don't read books to illustrate either pain or joy, but I suppose objectively, if you looked at my Goodreads list of books read, most of them would be pain rather than joy, because the genre, hateful word, that I read most is literary fiction, hateful term, and that tends to verge far more over pain because it's trying to get to grips with life than joy. So that's the first thing to say. These are not my judgments, these are just judgments I believe would be made about my reading. Second of all, Brian, who tagged me, said that he felt it was very much down to the endings of books as to which side of the coin you ended up. Was it joy, a book ostensibly about joy, or a book ostensibly about pain? And I find myself disagreeing with Brian on that, because if you go back to the origins of sort of Greek drama, you had tragedy, which was sown with some very formal elements in structure as laid out by Aristotle in his Poetics, as to how the drama, and particularly the tragedy, is brought about. But also certain specific concepts such as hubris, the fatal flaw that brings down the hero, which means that throughout the play that it's been seeded with these elements of pain, and indeed they were so sort of harrowing on their audiences at the time that satire plays were introduced between the acts to bring a bit of light relief, to let the audience have a breather. And these were so successful in their own right that they sort of spun off to become a genre of Greek drama, as I say, in their own right. Now, technically comedy is not the same as joy, but in sort of opposition to tragedy, it very much is, I think, with the sort of notion. But although I suppose it can be slightly sort of demeaning to the concept of joy if you're saying comedy as light and fluffy and lewd is as function within the sort of Greek theatres. It's a tricky one, but I did disagree with Brian on that. But this concept of illustrating pain or illustrating joy, is that what the author is setting out to do? I don't think most authors think like that. And another thing that Brian mentioned in one of his answers was the notion of conflict. Well, again, I have a background in writing drama before I started writing fiction, and conflict had to be in all plays. You were taught that, told that, three-line whip that. But to me, the element of conflict was only ever yet another structural device, a sort of formal element that was supposed to be in plays. But there are plenty of plays that don't do that at all, because it's just a building block of what we take by conventional drama, as is joy and pain. I don't think they are ends in and of themselves, but obviously because we are dealing with the spectrum and the palette of human emotion, they're going to come into a lot of books, of course. If you want to deal with the human condition, what makes life, what makes us human, all this sort of stuff, of course you're going to involve joy and pain. It's also worth saying, I think, that pain is locked in with memory, even if it's a physical pain, like when you fell down as a kid and broke your arm. There's a sort of muscle memory, or more accurately, a nervous sort of pain memory of that. And pain and suffering can always recur because, as I say, they're locked into memory. Whereas joy, which can be conjured up through memory, remembering happier times, or you look at a photo album of a holiday or something, but they're much more fleeting. Joy is much harder to grasp hold of. Joy is much harder to analyse, I think. And in artistic terms, writing about happy and joyous things is not nearly as exciting and edgy and tense and dramatic as writing about nasty things to do with pain and suffering. So again, there are all these elements. First of all, that joy is much more fleeting than much more long-lasting pain. It's much harder to conjure up, I think, joy through memory of joy than it is conjuring up memory of pain. Or pain is far more likely to be ongoing if it's an emotional pain or a pain attached to memory rather than physical pain. And all these sorts of things. So, you know, this is a deeply layered concept. So, 2, do you see books about pain as more intellectually valuable? Why or why not? Well, again, it's very much sort of wrapped around the answer I gave in my first one. It's not necessarily more, intellectually valuable, but it's more commonly a treatment for intellectual writing and intellectual literature. As I say, I mean, as a writer, in fact, as a teenager, when I was first turning out to face the world and ask the questions of the world rather than sort of ensconced in my domestic boyhood, I asked myself, what is the nature of pleasure? What is happiness? And these are weighty philosophical questions that have been broached for an answer, particularly by the ancient Greeks, the Epicureans and people like this. But I don't think they've been successfully answered to this day. And again, you know, it comes back to my notion that happiness is much more fleeting. Why can't we preserve it? Well, one of the reasons why you can't preserve happiness is you've had a wonderful day out in the park with a partner, but it was a Sunday and next Monday, and on the Monday you have to go to work and back into the mundanity. So joy is almost like a relief or a break from the world, and you're taken to this higher state, higher mental state. I mean, think about what the first flush of love is when you fall in love, and you sort of literally become detached from the rest of the world. You only have eyes for your partner. Whereas pain, as I say, is much more ongoing, constant, has many, many analysable sources, from physical pain to emotional pain to moral pain, existentialist pain. I mean, to me, pain is underwritten by death. And while people still believed in an afterlife and heaven and even hell to some extent, that was sort of shunted to one side. But I think in the modern world, it's far more acceptance that there isn't a heaven and a hell and an afterlife. And but we've never really faced up to what death is, and that means we are in pain, whether consciously or unconsciously, when people die around us, because we're not reconciled to it. And it can warp our own life, not only the death of others, but thinking about your own death, particularly obviously as you grow older. It will warp your life, how you see life and how you live your life. Because if you're building up achievements, possessions, relationships, loved ones, attachments, they're all going to be stripped from you by death. And then, to me, that therefore warps life by, well, quite why are we pursuing all these things if they're sort of transient? And it comes back to brain chemistry, I suppose. You get highs from joy. You get high from love, chemical high in your brain. And you want to avoid the not only the physical nervous pain that's all radiated through your system of, as I say, if you fall down, break your leg, but there's also mental pain and anguish, obviously, and those chemicals involved in that. You want to avoid that, obviously. So I don't see them as more intellectually valuable. I will say that the one time that I was shortlisted for a book prize as a writer, I went to read the other books I was up against. And one of those titles was an uplift, what was now called an uplift book. And I didn't get on with it at all, both for the writing, which I didn't think was very good, but also for the concept, because it seemed to me entirely unrealistic in the in the setup that the book had brought about, and in a way this comes back to Brian's point, and again why I disagree with it, because their book teetered throughout on this could all go horribly wrong, or the female heroine could break out from her religiously restrictive upbringing and become a fully independent, rounded woman. And it could have gone either way. The writer was trying to convey that it could have gone either way, but actually if you see how it was written, that was never really an option, in the same way as 1984 by George Orwell could only end in one way, because such was the power of the totalitarian state. But anyway, in this book there was an uplifting ending, because she broke out, and so by Brian's reckoning that would always be an uplifting book, a book of joy throughout. But it was, I didn't buy it. You know, I thought that ending was unlikely, was proportionally less likely than a down ending. So I personally would never pick up a book because I'd been told it was uplifting. Equally though, I probably wouldn't pick up a book because I was told it was all about suffering. You know, I have no interest in reading Shuggie Bain, the Booker Prize winner, no matter how good it is, because I'm done with books about addiction. You know, I'm the son of an addict, albeit not alcoholic in that case. I grew up with it. I see no need to bone up on it through other people's takes on it. It was part of my upbringing, it was part of my youth, that I had to live with it. And I have no desire to revisit that. I've left all that behind. I made my reconciliation with my late father on it. His addictions actually drove him to the point of a very serious suicide attempt. And as a writer, I did have to try and get to grips with that, rather than his addictions, although that obviously feeds into it. So I did, you know, I spent a long time writing about, or thinking about, how to write about suicide. I wrote several versions of the true life events of that act, and ultimately it came together in one of my novels called Not in My Name, which is a book ostensibly about sort of Islamic extremism, but I was comparing a domestic suicide with the mentality of a suicide bomber, and drawing the parallels and also the contrasts between the two. So I think it very much depends on what your personal bag is, what your own experiences of pain and suffering, whether you want to keep examining them and reopening them, or whether you've come to terms with them and you feel that you don't want that particular thing reopened. So in the case of suicide, I would always still consider reading books about suicide, but I have no desire to read books about addiction. So that's kind of weird how that plays out. 3. Why do you think major book prizes like the Booker and the Pulitzer mainly award books about pain? Well, again, as I say, I think they're in the vast majority of all books. Second of all, it's much harder to write happiness in an interesting and engaging way. Brian mentioned Leonard and Hungry Paul. I haven't read it. I have no desire to read it because I cannot stand whimsy. And I know it's a very highly thought of book, but I don't have the time to be dealing with whimsy. I don't see what it contributes to my view of the world. That's not to say I don't like comic books. When I say comic books, comedy books, books that are comic. I absolutely do, but one element of comedy I cannot be doing with is whimsy, because it seems to be the absolute polar opposite of pain, in a way that I think it degrades our concepts of pain. Now, that's not to say no one can write a whimsy book. Of course they can. It's just my personal taste. I've absolutely no desire. So I think it's very hard to write an engaging, serious-minded and literary book on joy, again, because it's fleeting. You know, it's hard to sustain a 300-page novel all about joy. So yeah, and just the probabilities, because so many more books are written about pain than joy. 4. Do you use and agree with the phrase guilty pleasures? Why or why not? It's a weird one, this, for me, because in literature I don't. Like Brian, I don't really care what people think about, you know, what I read and stuff, and I will put it out there. I mean, I haven't read for many years what could be seen as guilty pleasure books written by English football hooligans, which I used to read in my 20s. And I've mentioned that openly in tags and stuff. I don't read them anymore, so they don't appear in my book review videos anymore. But I have mentioned them in tags because I'm not ashamed of them. That's where I was at. I actually wrote a play about football hooliganism, so of course I would read them. But, you know, is it a guilty pleasure? I don't know. So in books, no, I don't. And yet with music, yeah, I probably do have guilty pleasures. But before I sort of get into that, guilt is largely imposed on you by external forces, be it parents, other people in your life, religious bodies of theology and morals, or society. It's very much internalised from without. And I think there's sort of increasing moral relativism these days. So I have a problem with guilt, because it's normally, you can ascribe it to the influence of others, and other people judging you. But for all that, as I say, in music, I do have some guilty pleasures. I'm not quite sure why this differs from books, but anyway. So for example, the Stranglers, who were a British punk band that sort of started in the, well, I mean, they were around for a long time before punk broke, which gave them their opportunity. But their first two albums, I think definitely could be called misogynist in the lyrics. And yet, the music, and particularly the bass, the sound of the bass in it, make me overlook the appallingness of some of the lyrics. And yeah, I won't give up listening to the Stranglers, even though by all rights I should, because they are offensive. But you know, I no longer go to concerts, and I never saw the Stranglers live anyway. But music on the whole, you tend to listen to in private, so which I suppose is an aspect of a guilty pleasure. But then again, why reading a book? You know, I can't explain why, basically. 5. Do you think books centering joy are guilty pleasures? Well, I don't. I don't see why they should come under that category. But as I say, I don't hold any book as a guilty pleasure anyway. 6. Do you read in secret? Are there books you read but never talk about because of embarrassment, shame, or guilty about liking them? No. Again, music possibly in my sort of teens and 20s. Now I'm old and ugly enough, it's not, you know, it's not really a factor. And who do you tag? Well, I tag Zena over at Beating Around the Books. I tag Mark over at A Book Time with Elvis. I tag Pay over at Attention. Yeah, that will do for now. So thanks very much to Brian at Bookish for tagging me. It's an interesting one, but it's also a bit odd, because to strip books down to a binary pair of joy and pain, I think is a bit simplistic. But anyway, till next time, thanks very much.